Hello, everyone. Dr. Rappaport is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the attending child and adolescent psychiatrist at Harvard teaching affiliate, Cambridge Health Alliance. She is the author of the Behavior Code, Practical Guide to Understanding and Teaching the Most Challenging Students. Take it away, Doctor.
Today, we're going to be talking about how to navigate inappropriate sexual behavior in schools. And we know there's been a major social upheaval with the Me Too movement and powerful Hollywood men being toppled. And it's an opportunity for schools and parents to think about how do we keep our children safe and at the same time have an understanding about developmentally appropriate behavior. And part of this lecture was inspired by a wonderful parent who had come to me around her middle school student who there were concerns about inappropriate sexual behavior. And I want to start with a letter that she wrote to me. And I had asked her, what would you like schools and parents to know? And what she said is that when it comes to sexual behavior, schools are on guard, as they should be, and especially at the middle school level, though it's important for schools to recognize that certain behaviors are age appropriate and to avoid pathologizing each and everything. And she said she learned the hard way that when a school comes from a place of panic, it's impossible to communicate with the family in a constructive way. And she shared that her son is impulsive and immature. And although he lagged behind physically and socially, he learned quickly that there was an audience of peers who would react to certain behaviors, such as belly dancing in the lunchroom or lifting his shirt off to show off his six-pack. She said to know her son, you would know that the sexual piece of this was secondary to the attention-seeking piece. And she said that much of her son's behavior was much more innocent in reality than the way it was portrayed by the school. When a teacher said that Ben is putting objects in his pants, it turned out to be related to the idea that they were exploring inventions, and he thought that it would be neat to tuck in your shirt a certain way and put a pouch where you could hold scissors and pencils. And the other incident that he had where he was belly dancing in the doing a lap dance at the lunch table, when his parents followed up, he said, I don't even know what that is. And she said, this is a kid who covers his eyes when two people kiss on TV and plays with Legos or shoots baskets to unwind. He's not searching the internet for porn or Snapchatting with girls. And she cautions us that the context is relevant when formulating a narrative about a student. She also went on to talk about the context that in the schools, a few months prior to Joe's difficulties, the administrators came under fire because there was a teacher who had sexually harassed a colleague and was also inappropriate with some students. And he was eventually placed on leave, but the school had come under criticism by the parents about that the school had not acted swiftly enough or communicated when the initial allegations had started. And she wonders whether this may have contributed to the intensity around her son's quote-unquote sexualized behavior. She also said, again highlighting context, that it was notable at home that none of these behaviors were seen, and that in the setting of a team sport that he played, that the coaches hadn't seen anything like this. So if we step back, this is a mother's heartfelt plea for us as educators and as advocates to figure out ways to understand a child's behavior when it's sexually inappropriate. And I'm going to stop. She'll stop in a second. So I want to move from sharing this letter to describe three kids. First, we have the 7th grader blurting out to other students drawing a penis on a bulletin board. Then you have a more serious with a red flag of a kindergarten girl who's strutting down the hall, taking her clothes off, climbing on the table, and saying fuck, 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 and having tantrums where she tips over the cubby holes. Then you have a 7th grader who corners a developmentally delayed 5th grader and threatens digital penetration. And the last situation is a student who has autism who's in trouble for stalking a girl, and the girl's parents take out a restraining order. Many of us who work in schools have heard something like this, and these are real cases. My focus here is mainly on assessing and intervening with students who may have an underlying mental health issue who display inappropriate sexualized behavior in the classroom. But it's impossible to disentangle this from the broader issues and contexts of sexual misconduct in schools, including teacher misconduct, peer sexual harassment. So you'll see I'm also going to touch on these issues like school climate. It's difficult to hear about this. It may bring up uncomfortable feelings. And I think you and I have an obligation to both recognize our discomfort and take a break at times when it may be overwhelming, but also to see if we can learn from that discomfort so that we can have the kind of powerful dialogue that's so important in keeping our kids safe. Some of the pictures I'm going to show may seem a little bit provocative. I intentionally tried to stimulate this as an opportunity for us to have a thoughtful discussion. So the big questions that we're going to be addressing is, what does normal sexual behavior look like? What is problematic sexual behavior? How do systemic factors affect this? And what's the differential diagnosis of individual students with inappropriate sexual behavior? And how do we keep kids safe? So we have a lot to cover. What does normal sexual behavior look like? There's not a lot of research about what normal sexual behavior looks like. But we do know that it's around spontaneous behavior, it's intermittent, it's not the sole focus of the child's play, it's lighthearted, there's no objection, it doesn't cause the child anxiety, guilt, or shame, and it's not coercive, and it decreases when an adult intervenes and provides redirection. So when a child is 3 years old, they're interested in everything. They're exploratory, they imitate adults, and they may want to look at other little children's bodies. They'll be interested in adult bodies, and so they may inadvertently touch a preschool teacher's breast, and they can be found in the bathroom with their pants pulled down with another peer. It's totally not developmentally appropriate to have a preschooler tongue kissing, and that happens in 3% of 3 to 5 year olds. By the time you get to grade school, kids have figured out the kind of boundaries of not looking at other kids' body parts, but they certainly, and all of us who have kids know, may have a fascination with talking about farts and different kinds of body functions. But they understand that it's socially taboo to masturbate in public, and but they may do some disruptive, inappropriate talk about sex. What's problematic sexual behavior? With problematic sexual behavior, it happens with children of different ages. It's associated with strong upset feelings. It causes harm and doesn't respond to school intervention. It can be problematic self-touch, non-intrusive and repetitive touching, showing body parts, sexual touching without permission, such as poking, rubbing, sexual interactions, and it can be distributing youth-produced sexual images and coercive or aggressive sexual conduct or penetration. In the school setting, I just want to cover that briefly. It includes sexual words or phrases to peers or teachers, making sexual gestures, making noises, or engaging in pretend play that stimulates sex, making sexual invitations to others, inappropriately touching another person, or masturbating in the classroom. And there's no clear research on how many students display this type of behavior. But for any family that's been involved with this kind of incident, or teachers who've managed this kind of behavior, it can be one of the more upsetting events in a child's development. What I want to step back and think about is oftentimes a child, when we're talking about sort of normal developmental behavior, gets, as I talked about, can get redirected. And I was asking a teacher, middle school teacher, I was in CrossFit, and I said to him, well, what do you do when there's sexually inappropriate behavior? He says, like what? Like kids touching each other's butts or looking at their breasts? And I said, yeah, well, like, what do you do? He says, oh, I have 4 words for that. I'm like, great, I don't make a short lecture. Go to the office. So that primarily is what teachers are going to do, is to set a clear boundary and hope it doesn't happen again. Another teacher, I was in Poland with my book, The Behavior Code, and she shared with me a story which makes you realize that this is international sexually inappropriate behaviors in schools, sometimes developmentally, where she walked into a classroom and there were 4 boys and they had drawn a penis on the bulletin board. And she said, she was a science teacher, and she said, I didn't know that you had a burgeoning interest in cactus. So in normal development, you redirect, it settles. Kids figure it out. There are situations, though, it's important to step back and look at systemic factors that affect this. I have a clinical history of having worked 23 years in a school district doing safety assessments. And what I can tell you is that it's really important when you're having inappropriate sexual behavior in schools to step back and think about the context in the school and what's happening. And I asked Jonathan Cohen, who was the former executive director of the National School Climate, about what are the kinds of questions that you want to be asking in a school to understand the context if inappropriate behavior is happening. And the first step is that you want to survey kids and adults and find out questions like, what are the hot spots in the school area where there may be more likely a tendency to have inappropriate behavior happening? And sometimes you'll hear things like when kids go to the bathroom or when they're in the cafeteria or during recess. And then having the school come up with a plan with how they're going to address that. For example, if there are incidences that happen in the bathroom, about having kids go to the bathroom in pairs or having an adult check on what's going on. And the other aspect he talked about is, are we teaching children to listen and honor their feelings? And are we talking with students about the complicated continuum of consensual to non-consensual sex and social and emotional experiences? The other aspect to think about systemically is around race, class, and culture. Sex and what is considered appropriate behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. So sometimes there may be alarm bells in a school because a kindergartner may share that they are spending the night in during morning sharing time, that they'll share that they spent the night in their parents' bed. But in some cultures that may be acceptable. So teasing it out and not immediately assuming that sexual abuse is happening can be really important, so that we understand what the accepted norms are in different cultures. And with class, we know that there is white privilege, and sometimes things can get heightened around an interracial event that happened. So what are the differential diagnoses of individual students with inappropriate sexual behavior? The 4 areas that I want to talk about are ADHD and impulsive behavior, autism spectrum, trauma or inappropriate exposure to sexuality, and bipolar disorder. So with ADHD, you can, as we had with the child that we heard about at the beginning, you can have kids that just blurt out stuff. And usually when they process it later, they feel remorse and want the opportunity for repair. And it's important to think about how you cultivate that in a school setting. And there are programs like the ALERT program, which helps kids to recognize the level of energy and then figure out what to do to bring it down. And you can also teach kids about self-monitoring and provide cues to students in terms of green light, yellow light, and focusing on how they can begin to have an ability to gain judgment, basically. And in terms of in the classroom, what's important with an intervention is to really keep an eye on how you tone down the reaction of other students, so that the ADHD child doesn't end up getting secondary gain from saying stupid stuff. In the context of autism, one of the things that's troubling is if you have kids who are young kids who need to have their to be taken care of in a closely monitored way, where they might need help with wiping themselves or cleaning themselves. Those are potentially kids who can be more vulnerable to abuse. And then you have kids who may be autistic, who do self-stimulation and may end up masturbating in the classroom by jumping, either touching themselves or wiggling on the chair. And that's an important situation where you want to get an occupational therapist and think about how you may do replacement behavior, which means that you say, for instance, if you have a boy who is stimulating himself, giving him a rabbit foot so that there's an alternative. And then you have the situations where kids who are on the spectrum may end up doing behavior that is very provocative. So they may come up to a girl and say, "Your breasts look juicy." And what I talk about in the behavior code with any behavior is that kids can learn that negative behavior is fast, efficient, and predictable. So part of what you want to do with kids who are autistic is to help them learn about appropriate ways to gain attention and support them that way. So with a child who is who's autistic, who is ending up learning that sexualized comments are taboo, and that they end up saying something when they want to express their frustration or anger that's really inappropriate, you want to help them about how they're going to communicate that they need attention without derailing. So I had a situation of a 6th grader who was upset about eating alone in the cafeteria, and he started to gyrate like he was having intercourse, and then stood up on the table and took 2 feminine pads and rubbed them up against his cheek. And this, when you're trying to intervene, you want to help them with how can you script, and Michelle Garcia Winner has an excellent curriculum around this. How do you script them so that they can gain the social skills and not do inappropriate behavior? And sometimes you have students who are autistic who, when they are starting to be attracted to other students, that they get themselves into trouble. They may have a crush, and then there was this boy who started to do minimum work because he was obsessing about this girl, and he followed her home and looked through the window, and he hid his phone from the teachers and would take pictures of her, and the parents of the girl ended up having a restraining order. And when the principal talked to this boy, he had no idea that this was crossing a boundary. So we have to be mobilized, and a school social worker is critical in this, and outside therapy, in being able to be explicit about the hidden social rules and help with social scripting. And the other aspect about it is to do what's called a wellness inventory. And that means that when you have a child that may have who's autistic and has sexually inappropriate behavior, and this is also true with kids with bipolar disorder, is you want to make sure, are they getting enough exercise? Are they getting sleep? Do they have a regular schedule, good nutrition? Are they having a intense enough social diet? So you want to be understandably concerned about if there's inappropriate sexual behavior, but not lose track of also being able to totally conceptualize, make sure the other needs are met. With trauma and inappropriately sexualized kids, it's some of the hardest work I've done is to work with children who've been sexually abused, particularly under 12 years old. It's absolutely devastating to their sense of self. Now, what I want to say is many kids who've been sexually abused don't go on to having sexually inappropriate behavior, but the younger they are, say under 7 years old, the more likely that's about to happen. And I had a situation of a 7-year-old who was getting really escalated when the teacher was reading about he had been sexually abused, and the teacher was reading about a father-son adventure. And he went over and took a marker and wrote, "Suck my dick," and ended up having explosive kind of behavior. Two things about it. Sometimes when kids have been traumatized this way, teachers and caretakers may be overly accommodating and not intervene early enough to really set clear expectations about what's acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. And these children are exquisitely sensitive to shame. So it's this balancing act of both trying to be responsive and at the same time setting supports in. And one of the ways you can set supports is to figure out what are the triggers or the vulnerabilities to these students. And so previewing what kinds of, particularly in high school, unfortunately, there can be instances where there can be very provocative English books and various things that can come up. And you want to be mindful that there may be students who are triggered by this and make accommodations. For children with bipolar, and I am not someone who is quick to diagnose a child with early onset bipolar. More likely to happen when you have a family history of bipolar, and and what's most important is that 10% of children who have early onset bipolar can present with sexualized behavior as their first presenting symptom. And over 40 to 60% of kids who have bipolar can have sexualized behavior. So I had a situation of a kindergarten student who was the one I talked about briefly at the beginning, who was wreaking havoc in the classroom, getting on the table saying, "Fuck, fuck, fuck," strutting down the hallway, tearing off her clothes. And The school had filed with suspicion of child abuse, and I understand that all school adults and caretakers are required mandated reporters, but this shut down the ability for them to get the kind of information they needed in which was that so when I did a safety assessment, the principal thankfully was able to get the parent in, even though the parent was furious, and I obtained the information of the family history of bipolar disorder, and we were able to get this child into treatment. So how do we keep kids safe? I'm going to talk about a couple of things. What do we do after an incident? What do we do if we have adult perpetrators in the school? And what's the point where students need to be removed from this setting? And do juvenile sex offender programs work? And what can we teach our children about being safe? So, what do we do after an incident? First of all, it's incredibly important to talk about something once it's happened in the school, whether it's with peers or whether it's with teachers. And sometimes people just hope that if they don't talk about it, it'll just go away. And sometimes you'll need to get something like restorative justice, which is a way of having facilitated communication, because sometimes when these incidents happen, it can be tremendously polarizing in the school community. The other aspect that's important is the idea of, and this is a provocative idea I'm saying, but equal treatment within the school setting for both the victim and the alleged perpetrator. Sometimes some of the most shaming experience can happen to a family where there is a worry that their child has done something inappropriate, sexually inappropriate. And the other caveat, of course, is that in a school setting, if a victim comes forth, you want to believe them. That's our job. And you don't want to ask questions, you want to believe. And the Atlantic Monthly has an article that they talked about with middle school and high school, and they talked about a terrible situation where the school administrator was saying asking questions like, what were you wearing and why didn't you scream louder? And that's clearly not what we want. The other thing is, it's important to have a memorandum of understanding so that between the school and the police, so if instances like happen like this, that there is a working relationship between the school and the police. And it's also important for schools to create a relationship with a group that does sexual assault advocacy. It's an incredible emotional roller coaster for students who choose to come forward. And if it goes to the point where there's a DA office that gets involved, you want to make sure that there has been unbiased support. What's the point where a student needs to be removed from the setting? When I've done safety assessments, that's probably the key question. And the reality is, in schools are pretty quick if there's been something, and understandably a sexually inappropriate event in the school, to think about, is this the right setting for this student? And I'm involved when, for example, there may be a lot of political heat on the school system, and we want to make a good decision around the context of that behavior. And in situation, I may be sharing responsibility with a school district if it is something that was a stupid act, but developmentally within the norms of a student, and we can be fairly confident that the kind of behavior isn't going to happen again. If there is too much error history between a student and other peers or teacher, in that situation, it may make a lot of sense to be placed in a therapeutic setting where there's a smaller teacher-student ratio and a child can learn to expand their skill base. And a situation like that that I was involved with when I'm talking about error history was a child who was a sixth grader who was constantly in a self-contained classroom, who was constantly talking about the teacher's sexual body parts and drawing pictures of penis, and the teacher was exhausted, and there wasn't room for change in that setting, and you had to press the reset button. What's important for us to know is sometimes what happens with these students is that they are put in juvenile sex offender programs, and there is no evidence that these programs work. Basically, and they make a lot of money, but what they've done is taken adult sex offender programs and plopped them into juvenile sex offender private programs, usually, that can be cost shared with schools, and they are ineffective. The only evidence-based treatment for juvenile sex offenders is multisystemic family therapy, which makes sense because many of these kids have a lot of they need a lot of support around multiple arenas. And multisystemic family therapy does advocacy work and provides treatment in the home and works with the school and is like a wraparound program. So the other aspect of keeping kids safe is that unfortunately there can be situations in schools where the school adults may have done something heinous and unlawful, and sometimes you have a continuum. There's surveys that say over 10% of kids 7th through 12th grade have had something inappropriate happen with a school adult, and it may be something like a teacher asking a student to sit on their lap, or talking about putting a flower during graduation and pinning it on and making inappropriate comments when they're doing that. And there's a couple of very important aspects that we want to think about. One is caution around the hiring process, and that to ask questions and pursue references. And there's a woman, Cheryl Shakeshaft, who's a professor in Virginia, and she's an expert on this. And she said she told me a terrible story, and it's true that sometimes in school settings, when you've had inappropriate behavior, the staff member resigns from a school and then goes on to another school to perpetrate an offense. And she said you have to be pointed about the questions that you ask when you're following up on references, and that you ask, were there any allegations of improper behavior? Were there ever reports of drug or alcohol abuse? Was there any disciplinary action for sexual abuse or any other kind of abuse? And was there any inappropriate behavior towards students, including flirting? And she told me a story of a teacher who had resigned, having had inappropriate behavior, went to another school district. Those questions weren't asked, and he ended up being inappropriate with a girl, and she ended up dying by suicide. So this is a really important point of entry where we can amplify it to keep kids safe. And the other aspect is to train both caretakers and school people to be aware of any warning signs. So, back 20 years ago when I was providing consultations to schools, it wasn't unusual for teachers who had a troubled student to maybe invite them home to their house or give them rides. But that's something where if it's happening in these times, that's a signal to wonder if there is something sexually inappropriate happening. So what can we teach? I would encourage all of us to watch this movie, and I wasn't paid to say this, Audrey and Daisy. It's a very disturbing Netflix movie that's about two girls that were sexually assaulted in high school, and it actually is a documentary that takes place in the schools in terms of the follow-up, and they have good tools for if either guardians were to watch it, or schools with a facilitated discussion with parents and students. It's very helpful. I think it's important as both family members and educators to think I'm talking about now, the next steps are about doing inventory, about understand. So one is to have our own self-knowledge. So watching that movie would be helpful. The other is thinking about how to have a discussion about understanding consent. And there's a wonderful video about called Cup of Tea, which helps with providing a sort of humorous way of thinking about the various decision makings that happen with consent. The other aspect is helping kids with scripted language. How do girls assert themselves? How do we help if people are uncomfortable? How do we help them listen to their own bodies and manage complicated situations? And there are two curriculums that have been suggested to me that are useful for schools. One is called Improv Boston, and the other is Second Step, that's been developing a curriculum around this. And the other aspect that we want to help students with is around decision making and reducing risk, and thinking about where do we have situations for kids to learn how they navigate dicey situations. And many clinicians and parents are not comfortable in the digital world. I'm probably one of the more digitally incompetent people, but we have to be comfortable asking asking our students about how they are navigating on the various social medias, and to really give clear messages about sexting and cyber harassment, and not only looking on the side of sexting from the point of who is sending it, but also having clear expectations and consequences for kids who are asking for this to be sent. And I was alerted that it's not just girls sending images, but it's often sometimes girls pressuring other girls to send it. And so it's not just boys asking it, but we want to be very mindful about how we can do that. And the last piece is that on some level, we have not mobilized for middle school, high school to create protective environments. And we need to think of our community as a powerful antidote for keeping kids safe. And one of the things that they do in colleges is, and they've shown by the research that it's supportive, is helping kids learn about being bystanders, and rather than being bystanders, being upstanders, and shifting the social norms. Because sometimes the reason that other kids don't intervene with inappropriate behavior, sexually inappropriate behavior, is because they think that the rest of their peers think it's okay. And University of New Hampshire, and the references will be available, has a research-based program that looks at both doing surveys in the school and providing a 4 hours of teaching, trying to create a supportive environment for kids. And the other thing I would say is, we all know that there is a limited pot for interventions. So you have drug, alcohol, sex, bullying curriculums, and it's really important to do an integrated approach where we communicate a strong message to our kids that we are committed to keeping them safe. Thank you.